With every good boss fight that challenged you or offered some fun mechanics to embrace this year, there were several that didn't. Damage sponges, cheap attacks, or just being an underwhelming threat as a whole. These are the 12 worst bosses of 2021 that encompass these problems and many more. DIMITRESCU'S daughters, Resident Evil Village. In the lead-up to Resident Evil Village, Dimitrescu and her daughters, Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela, seemed like they'd be a major part of the game. While that proved false, Lady Alcina still managed to provide a memorable fight. The same can't be said for her daughters though. After effortlessly stalking Ethan throughout the castle, being invulnerable to all kinds of damage, and seemingly being unkillable, they were undone by a gust of cold wind. It's like killing if the T-1000 was killed after being frozen and didn't reassemble itself, but on 3 separate occasions, so you got the point. Super Adaptoid, Marvel's Avengers. You'd be forgiven for thinking that Marvel's Avengers is still pretty bad, because in many ways it is. Even Spider-Man's release registered as little more than a blip. And while it has some decent boss fights over the past year, the Super Adaptoid, when it launched, was not one of them. As yet another robot foe, its main hook is having the abilities and weapons of all of the Avengers. This seemed cool at first, until it became quickly obvious that it offered little more than an overwhelming array of attacks, all dealing insane amounts of damage, with no cover, and very little health drops. When burning through a boss by stacking tons of damage buffs is best just because the fight is too painful to actually play, you know you've screwed up. Lance, BALAN WONDERWORLD. Let's somewhat ignore that this boss fight could induce seizures before the Day 1 patch fixed it. I say somewhat because it's still amazingly incompetent. Despite some epic music, Lance was just the lamest of big bads. He uses some slow-moving clones, a couple of projectiles, and some fodder enemies while laughing the same annoying laugh. Then he's stupid enough to get hit by his own tentacles, despite spending most of his time floating around the arena. His second form looks awesome, and is somewhat of an improvement at first, until all of your friends show up, lend you their powers, and you hit some very obvious weak points to defeat him. The fact that when it's all over, Lance is just dragged back into the Shadow Realm with no explanation doesn't help either. YAGAK, Outriders. YAGAK returns to cap off Outriders' inane story, wielding the power of the anomaly. Like the most annoying challenges in the game, he's a bullet sponge, simply floating about and soaking in tons of bullets. While his sandworm ability is pretty cool despite being very telegraphed, other moves like creating little minions that spew weak bullets at you are just meh. YAGAK eventually uses his chain whips to fight, but defaults to throwing random minions, and weakly grappling towards you along with his anomaly powers. After dumping a PMC's worth of ammo to defeat him, he's later revealed to be none the worse for wear and potentially returning in the future. Great. Thunder Serpent NARWA, Monster Hunter Rise. While Thunder Serpent NARWA is not the worst boss fight on this list, it's not particularly great either. Unlike Xeno'jiiva or Shara Ishvalda from Monster Hunter World and Iceborne respectively, many of its attacks just felt too tame. Much of the fight also felt like it hinged too much on platforming with the wire bug and operating the ballista turrets to deal damage, compared to Magnamalo, who was pushed to the wayside despite being more nuanced and interesting. NARWA just felt kind of flat, which would be damning enough for a final boss, but it wasn't even that since Rise didn't launch with the true final boss and ending, making things that much more anticlimactic. DAMON, No More Heroes 3. After a compelling boss fight against Fu, No More Heroes 3 could have just ended things there, but of course it has to upend expectations just because. Damon is revealed to be the final boss and pilots a giant mech. Naturally, Travis has to fight back, but he does so with an arsenal from Damon and Machina. How cool is that, until you realize that it's just a series of QuickTime events while the credits roll. And it doesn't even end there, as you're forced into one last fight with a mutated Damon, but in a mediocre Smash Bros. Setup. DAKYNE, The Ascent. If you can appreciate the shooting, then The Ascent can be a good time, which makes this final boss that much more baffling. Long story short, you're running around, fighting off a seemingly endless amount of enemies while hitting some switches. DAKYNE shows up as a named foe at the very beginning and can be instantly shredded. Was she the boss? Was this entire sequence the boss? Is the real final boss still out there? Whatever the case may be, this was a disappointing way to end the game. VHOLRAN IGNISERI Tales of Arise. One of the biggest annoyances about Tales of Arise's bosses is just how spongy they can be. VHOLRAN suffers from that as well, which can be annoying when having to deal with 2 straight phases of babbling. There's not a whole lot that's special about the fight mechanically, save for some very cool double-team attacks that your party executes, and even his mystic art feels less than special. Also, for someone who's one of the big bads that's pursued Alphen all throughout the story, the sheer one-dimensional nature of his character makes this feel more like filler than anything else. The Visionaries and Julianna, DEATHLOOP. Call it mismanaged expectations, but I expected the Visionaries and DEATHLOOP to be more threatening. Instead, they're less of actual boss fights and more like domino pieces that have to be set up after much busy work and knocked down once you're ready to end the loop. As such, the actual challenge comes from not dying in this entire process, which is fairly difficult once you've got the best slab of upgrades and weapons. Julianna also felt like a pushover during invasions, before the updates that supposedly improved her AI, and served as little more than a choose-your-ending sequence at the finale instead of posing any kind of threat. ICEWIND, Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance. A friggin' dragon to cap off the Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance campaign is fitting. Say what you will about the rest of the game, but at least this part feels right, until the fight actually begins. ICEWIND just kind of stands there while you beat it, and then it's straight to the ballista to bring it down. Then you fight some minions, deal some more damage, tank some surprisingly weak frost breaths, rinse and repeat. If it sounds boring, that's because it is. Upon defeat, it just kind of falls into the abyss, a suitably lame finish for a lame campaign. Pole Monarch, Gunfire Reborn. Considering this as the final boss that players faced at the end once Gunfire Reborn left early access, it's easy to see why one could be underwhelmed. The Pole Monarch looks opposing enough, but doesn't have a whole lot going on mechanically. The biggest problem is the end phase. Upon getting him down to a sliver of health, you're forced into a DPS check, where you must burn through hundreds of thousands of shields to finally win. Don't have tons of DPS? Well, you lose. Better luck on the next run. LUPA-LUPIN, BIOMUTANT. LUPA-LUPIN's backstory is admittedly tragic, and the whole cycle of revenge is a lot more compelling than this World Eater business, but as the final boss, it's a pretty big step down. Even though the World Eaters required vehicles and a mount to fight, they were all very large and imposing while having several different tactics. LUPA-LUPIN is a lot smaller and less threatening by comparison, mostly thrashing about. It does utilize a few interesting moves along with teleporting, but you're mostly just wailing on it until it unceremoniously drops, like it suddenly remembered that it's nap time. And with that, we reached the end of the video. Have anything to say? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we upload new videos every single day on GamingBolt, so please consider subscribing as it really helps us out. Thanks for watching.